Let me start this slowly, because this is one of those topics where speed is the enemy. If you've followed American politics even casually over the last decade, you've heard the phrase trade deficit thrown around constantly. It comes up in speeches. It comes up in debates. It comes up every time someone wants to explain why the economy feels broken. And usually, it's framed as something obvious. We import too much. We export too little. We're losing. It sounds almost childish in its simplicity. Like a scoreboard. But the reason this argument never goes away, no matter who's in power, is because the trade deficit is not a cause. It's a symptom. And symptoms can be wildly misleading if you don't understand what system they belong to. So before we talk about solutions, before we talk about tariffs or globalization or China or manufacturing jobs, we need to do something unglamorous but necessary. We need to understand what kind of system the United States is actually embedded in. Let's anchor this discussion with reality. According to recent data, the United States ran a monthly goods trade deficit of roughly $153 billion, the largest on record. 1 month. Not a year. If you project that trend forward, you're looking at more than $1.5 trillion a year in imports exceeding exports. That number alone is larger than the entire GDP of many advanced economies. So when people say, "This feels insane," or "This can't be sustainable," that reaction is emotionally reasonable. But here's the first uncomfortable truth. Large numbers don't explain themselves. They tell you something exists. They don't tell you why it exists. And if you misunderstand the why, your solutions won't just fail, they'll often make the problem worse. Here's mistake number 1, and it's everywhere. People talk about America's trade deficit as if it's mainly about other countries, especially specific ones: China, Mexico, Vietnam, Germany, Japan. But that's mixing up two very different concepts. A bilateral trade deficit simply means the US imports more from country A than it exports to country A. An overall trade deficit means the US imports more from the entire rest of the world combined than it exports. Only the second one actually matters. Why? Because bilateral deficits are often meaningless in a world of global supply chains. A product made in China might use Korean chips, German machinery, American software, and final assembly in Vietnam. It shows up as a Chinese export not because China captured all the value, but because China was the last stop. That's why the US can run a surplus with the Netherlands, not because Dutch consumers love American goods, but because a huge portion of US exports into Europe pass through Dutch ports. So when politicians brag about reducing the China deficit, they're often just watching trade pass through a different door. The overall deficit doesn't care which door the goods came through. An overall trade deficit creates a real constraint. If you import more than you export, year after year, you must finance the difference. You have to pay someone. And that payment has to come from somewhere. This is where trade stops being about containers and factories and starts being about capital flows, the thing politicians almost never want to talk about. At this point, someone usually introduces a standard economic identity. A country's trade balance equals its total savings minus its total investment. So the logic goes like this: if the United States invests more than it saves, it must import capital from abroad. That capital inflow shows up as a trade deficit. Therefore, the US trade deficit exists because Americans save too little. This is technically correct. And yet, if you stop here, you've explained nothing. Because that identity doesn't explain why the trade deficit doesn't correct itself over time. In most countries, persistent trade deficits trigger currency depreciation. When a currency falls, exports become cheaper, imports become more expensive, trade gradually rebalances. That's supposed to be the automatic stabilizer. But here's the puzzle. The US has been running trade deficits since the late 1970s, and the dollar has often remained strong, or even strengthened, during that entire period. That's not normal. That means something is overriding the textbook adjustment mechanism. This is the turning point of the entire discussion. Exchange rates do not serve just one function. They don't only balance trade. They balance trade plus capital flows together. And in the American case, capital flows completely dominate trade flows. The dollar is not a normal national currency. It is the core infrastructure of the global financial system. When global investors panic, they buy dollars. When central banks build reserves, they hold dollars. When institutions need safe collateral, they buy U.S. treasuries. So here's the counterintuitive result. Even when the U.S. imports more goods than it exports, massive demand for U.S. financial assets pushes the dollar up, not down. And a strong dollar makes imports cheaper for Americans, makes American exports more expensive for everyone else. Which means the trade deficit widens. This is not a failure of markets. This is the market doing its job. Let me say this clearly, because this is where most people emotionally resist the argument. America's trade deficit exists because the world wants American financial assets more than American goods. Foreign exporters don't take their dollar earnings and buy American refrigerators or cars. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. stocks, U.S. corporate debt, dollar-denominated assets of all kinds. So the cycle looks like this: America imports goods, the world earns dollars, those dollars flow back into U.S. financial markets, the dollar strengthens, imports become even easier to afford. That loop has been running for decades. And unless you break that loop, which would mean changing the global role of the dollar, the trade deficit cannot disappear. The U.S. trade deficit does not persist because Americans buy too much stuff, or because foreign countries are uniquely dishonest, or because one administration made bad trade deals. It persists because the global financial system actively pushes capital into the United States, keeping the dollar strong and imports cheap. That alone explains why the trade deficit refuses to correct itself. Now we can talk about everything else people usually want to start with: tariffs, trade wars, manufacturing, politics, and see why those debates so often miss the mark. Let's talk about tariffs, because tariffs are the most emotionally satisfying policy tool in this entire discussion. Tariffs feel like action. They're visible. They sound tough. They create a clear villain and a clear response. If imports are the problem, the logic goes, then make imports more expensive. On paper, that makes sense. More expensive imports should reduce demand. Domestic producers should gain breathing room. Exports should rise. The trade deficit should shrink. But that logic assumes something that is not true in the American case. It assumes trade flows drive the system. They don't. Capital flows do. As long as foreign capital continues pouring into the United States, into treasury bonds, stocks, corporate debt, real estate, Americans will still have the purchasing power to buy imports. Block one country, and supply chains reroute. Raise prices slightly, and consumers absorb them. Change bilateral trade patterns, and the overall deficit barely moves. This is why trade wars so often end up rearranging where imports come from without changing how much the U.S. imports overall. And here's the truly perverse part. In many cases, tariffs actually make the trade deficit worse. This is where intuition breaks down. Tariffs are inflationary. Inflation often leads to higher interest rates. Higher interest rates attract global capital. When global capital flows in, the dollar strengthens. A stronger dollar makes imports cheaper and exports less competitive. So you can end up in a situation where tariffs reduce imports from one country, but strengthen the dollar enough to increase imports from everyone else. That's not a theory. That's a mechanism. It's why you can have years of aggressive trade policy without any structural improvement in the overall deficit. The system absorbs the shock and reroutes around it. The irony no one likes to admit: tariffs is very profitable. Here's an irony that rarely gets discussed honestly. Tariffs generate revenue. Recent data shows U.S. customs duties reaching over $33 billion in a single month, which translates to roughly $400 billion a year if sustained. That's not trivial. That's real money. So when someone says, tariffs don't work, that depends on what you mean by work. They bring in cash. They shift bargaining power at the margin. They create political leverage. What they don't do is fix the structural driver of the trade deficit. And you can see this clearly when you compare tariff revenue to something else that has exploded. Interest costs. U.S. federal interest payments now exceed $100 billion per month due to rising debt and higher rates. So tariffs add hundreds of billions annually, while interest costs consume more than $1 trillion. One step forward on cash flow. Several steps backward on structure. This is the difference between treating symptoms and treating disease. Now we can finally name the system everyone is dancing around. The U.S. trade deficit is not a puzzle. It is a known paradox. It's called the Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who identified it in the 1960s, long before today's numbers existed. The dilemma is simple and brutal. If a country issues the world's reserve currency, it must supply that currency to the global system. The only reliable way to do that is by running external deficits. Those deficits undermine domestic industry and political stability over time. In other words, to stabilize the world, the reserve currency country must destabilize itself, at least partially. There is no clean solution inside this framework. You either give up reserve currency dominance, or accept persistent trade imbalances. Every promise of having both is fantasy. This is why manufacturing loss was not an accident. This brings us to one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the trade debate, manufacturing decline. People talk about it as if it were a betrayal, a policy failure, a mistake that could have been avoided. But from a system perspective, much of it was a trade-off, not an error. A strong dollar benefits financial markets, asset prices, government borrowing, global influence. A strong dollar hurts export competitiveness, labor-intensive manufacturing, tradable goods industries. You cannot maximize both simultaneously. When capital appreciation is prioritized, production takes a secondary role. This doesn't mean manufacturing couldn't exist. It means manufacturing operates under constant pressure. And over decades, pressure becomes displacement. Now we reach the part that spreadsheets struggle to capture. The social cost. A system that channels global capital into financial assets distributes rewards unevenly. If you are a financial professional, an asset owner, a tech founder, a government borrower, you benefit enormously. If you are a factory worker, a regional supplier, a community dependent on tradable goods, you feel relentless downward pressure. This isn't about laziness or skill. It's about incentive structure. Capital flows follow returns. Returns flow to scalable assets. People rooted in physical production get left behind. And when that happens, something crucial occurs politically. People stop blaming spreadsheets. They start blaming institutions. Why the political backlash was inevitable. This is the part many analysts pretend was surprising. It wasn't. If you run a system where asset holders prosper, wages stagnate, communities hollow out, and elites insist the math says this is fine, eventually people revolt against the system itself. Not with academic papers. With elections. With movements. With anger. Trade populism did not emerge because people suddenly misunderstood economics. It emerged because the economic structure stopped matching lived experience. When someone loses a factory job, telling them about currency reserve status is not persuasive. The system may be coherent. That doesn't make it legitimate in the eyes of those bearing the cost. So let's answer the question everyone keeps circling. Is the trade deficit bad? The only honest answer is the most irritating one. It depends. Trade deficits can exist in healthy, fast-growing economies driven by investment demand. They can also exist in fragile economies propped up by unsustainable capital inflows. The number alone doesn't tell you which one you're dealing with. What matters is what the deficit is financing and who bears the cost. In America's case, the deficit finances government borrowing, asset expansion, global influence. The cost is paid through deindustrialization pressure, inequality, political instability. That's not a moral judgment. It's an accounting reality. The question that cannot be dodged forever. So let's end this where the argument actually leads. The U.S. trade deficit is not a misunderstanding. It is not primarily about bad trade deals. It is not something tariffs alone can fix. It is the price of issuing the world's most demanded currency. The benefit is unmatched financial power. The cost is domestic strain. So, the real question is not, how do we eliminate the trade deficit? The real question is, how long is American society willing to bear the internal costs of sustaining global monetary dominance? That is not a technical question. It is a political one. And eventually, it is a historical one. If you remember one thing from this entire discussion, make it this: the US didn't lose control of the trade system. It designed it. And now it is struggling with the consequences of its success. Not because the system failed, but because it worked exactly as built.